Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for joining DBW today. All of us at California State Parks Division of Boating and Waterways appreciate your interest in our grant programs and your interest in protecting public health and safety along California's important and iconic coastline. Today's webinar is about DBW Shoreline Erosion Control and Public Beach Restoration grant programs. These programs can provide local assistance grant funding to public agencies that have identified a coastal erosion issue and want to plan or implement a solution that will benefit the public. My primary goals today are to explain the DBW programs, the process to apply for grant funding, and for successful applicants, what happens next. Within a few days after this webinar, a link of a recording to the session will be available at our website. And for those of you who are with me live today, as questions occur to you during the webinar, please send them to me using the direct messaging feature in the Microsoft Teams chat function. I will answer questions after I give my presentation, and if your question doesn't occur to you until after the webinar, please always feel free to reach out to me. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Casey Caldwell. I am a project manager at DBW, and since 2014, I've been the program lead for DBW Shoreline Erosion Control and the Public Beach Restoration Program. My email address and phone number are shown here, and I encourage you to contact me with questions about DBW's programs and your projects. And I also encourage you to contact me before starting the grant application process. It's mutually beneficial for DBW and potential applicants to discuss the projects you have in mind as early as possible, so we can determine whether your project is eligible for grant funding, and if so, which of our programs might be the best fit. And before I move on, I'd like to note that joining us on today's webinar, we have Karen Dill, who's the chief of DBW's Loans and Grants Unit, and Deborah Holmes, the manager of the Loans and Grants Unit. I'm grateful to have DBW management joining us for this webinar. So here's the roadmap for today's webinar, and there are a few specific things that I want to accomplish. My first goal today is to acquaint you with DBW's 2 coastal protection grant programs and the important differences between them. I'll discuss the types of projects we can fund under each program, and since I'm frequently asked about funding availability per year and per project, I'll briefly discuss those topics too. Next, I'll discuss the grant application process. I'll go over some specific requirements in the application, speaking about those items at a high level. And then finally, I'll discuss a few aspects of how successful applicants manage their DBW grants. And then once I've completed my presentation, I will respond to any questions that you've sent in. As a those of you who are not familiar with our division or our recent history, I'll share some brief background about us. Boating and Waterways was founded in 1957 as its own department within the state, and DBW remained a state department until 2013 when we merged into the California Department of Parks and Recreation. Today, DBW exists as a division within state parks. DBW's mission statement is shown on the slide, and the first part of that mission statement reads, to provide safe and convenient access to California's waterways. Coastal erosion control supports safe shoreline waterway access and falls within our mission. Safe and convenient public access to California's coastal waterways is a right protected under the state constitution, and preservation of certain segments of the shoreline is essential to maintaining critical public infrastructure located nearby, further supporting public safety. DBW's coastal protection programs conform to numerous state laws and policies. The list of laws and policies on this slide is not a list of all the laws and policies we follow in administering these programs, and this list doesn't even begin to get into things like environmental and permitting guidance. But the listed sources are particularly important to our program, so it's good for our stakeholders to be aware of them. The consistent message emanating from these listed laws and policies is that protection of public health and safety is the most critical factor guiding the state's approach to coastal protection. Now, it's not the only major factor we pay attention to. Other important considerations include preservation of low-cost recreational opportunities and environmental protection, and cost effectiveness of project investments. However, you'll hear me talk about the safety aspects of projects frequently during this presentation, because safety-focused projects, and in particular projects to protect critical public infrastructure, are the projects that are most likely to successfully obtain funding through these grant programs. That's it for the prologue, and I'll now move into a discussion of the 2 grant programs. And first, I'll talk about DBW Shoreline Erosion Control Program. This program is established in the Harbor's Navigation Code, and state law defines this program's allowable activities pretty broadly. Under it, DBW can provide grant funding for a wide variety of shoreline erosion control methods. That includes soft solutions like beach replenishment and dune restoration, and also hard solutions like seawalls and breakwaters and groins, and more innovative erosion control solutions like oyster reefs. The DBW can fund construction activities under this program, but we can also fund pre-construction activities like feasibility studies and project engineering and design. However, DBW cannot fund long-term post-construction maintenance and monitoring, and we can't fund like routine shoreline surveys that are not being conducted in conjunction with a particular project. And there are some limitations on our funding. Grant funding for this program requires matching funding by the local partner. Per statute and per DBW policy, for this grant program, state funding sources can provide up to 1/2 of the non-federal share of project costs. And if there is no federal funding for the project, the state can provide grant funds up to 50% of the project's overall budget. I'll discuss match in more detail during my discussion of the grant application itself. There is no dedicated state revenue or funding source for this program. In recent years, all new projects have been funded from the Harbors and Watercraft Revolving Fund, which is the primary revenue source for most of DBW's numerous programs. The amount of funds available from this source can vary from year to year, and there's no mandatory amount that any statute or regulation says must be devoted to this program. Therefore, there's no preset minimum or maximum amount of grant funding that will be available through this program in any given year. There is also no preset minimum or maximum amount of grant funds available per project. In recent years, grant sizes for individual projects have ranged from about $50,000 for studies to about $3 million for construction, but those amounts are more like benchmarks, and actual amounts can be higher or lower. Now, DBW hasn't funded a lot of projects recently under this program. In part, that's because we don't receive many applications for it. As many of you know, in recent times, hardened structures along the shoreline are often discouraged by various government agencies for reasons that are beyond the scope of this webinar. And for soft solutions like beach restoration, applicants tend to prefer to seek funding through the Public Beach Restoration Program, which I'll discuss shortly. That said, there are many locations where hard structures are the necessary and the most appropriate solution to whatever erosion problem is at the location. And DBW has funded shoreline erosion control projects recently. One such project is a seawall with a shoreline access stairwell incorporated into it at Memory Park in the city of Pismo Beach. This project is nearly complete and the stairway is open for public use. And another recently funded project is a coastal erosion protection structure in the county of Santa Cruz. This project was completed a couple of years ago. It's worth noting here that both of these projects were constructed with an obvious intent to improve safe public access to the shoreline. Both were also constructed to blend in as well as possible with nearby natural features. So to the extent hardened structures are allowed by oversight agencies, we've observed it's typically expected they won't only serve that essential protective erosion control function, but they'll also have an appearance that blends as well as possible with natural surroundings. So I'm going to switch and talk about Public Beach Restoration Program. This program is also established in statute, and it has a narrower focus than the Shoreline Erosion Control Program. Specifically, this program, Public Beach Restoration, can only be used for the engineered placement of sand on the beach or in the near shore environment, and that's statutory language. In addition to construction phase work, DBW can fund project feasibility studies and pre-construction engineering and design work under this program. However, we cannot fund general or routine beach condition surveys unless they're necessary for the construction of a specific beach restoration project. Now, the match contribution requirement is lower for this program than it is for the Shoreline Erosion Control Program. Pardon me. Usually, DBW can fund up to 85% of non-federal project costs instead of 50%. And again, we'll discuss the match requirement in more detail later. The Public Beach Restoration Fund is the funding source identified in statute for these projects. However, there is no dedicated revenue source for this fund in state law. For many years, DBW has used revenue from the Harbors and Watercraft Revolving Fund to fulfill our mandates under this program. But that leads to the same funding situations with the Shoreline Erosion Control Program, where funding levels each year are unpredictable and no amount of annual program funding is guaranteed. And as with the Shoreline Erosion Control Program, there's no preset minimum or maximum amount of grant funds available per project. I get asked about that a lot. There's no minimum or maximum. As a reference point, in recent years, project grant sizes have ranged from about $40,000 for studies to $6.5 million for construction. Again, those numbers could be higher or lower. Now, examples of projects funded under this program include several long-term projects led by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, federal projects. And pictured here is one of them, which is the Orange County Beach Erosion Control Project, better known as Surfside Sunset. The 12th iteration or the 12th stage of this project was constructed in 2009, and designs have been prepared for the upcoming next phase, stage 13. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency on this project, and DBW partners with the County of Orange and several local stakeholder agencies to fully fund the non-federal cost share for this project. The DBW has also funded local projects of widely varying sizes. Over the last couple of decades, DBW has assisted with construction, design, and really all kinds of studies for large and small locally led projects in all coastal regions of the state. One more type of project that you might not be aware of. It's been funded under both of our programs in the recent past. For the last 15 years, DBW has provided financial support to federal, state, local, and regional governments to help them develop written regional sediment management plans, or RSM plans. This effort has been led by the California Coastal Sediment Management Workgroup, which is a federal-state partnership involving the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and many other federal and state stakeholder agencies, including DBW. At this time, almost all populated regions of our state's coastline are discussed in at least a draft version of one of these RSM plans. DBW can continue to support the development and updating of these plans through our grant programs that I'm discussing today. To learn more about DBW's support of CS&W and to learn more about CS&W's research and activities, please consult the link that's listed here on the slide, or feel free to contact me after the webinar and I'll be happy to tell you more and send you the link. So that concludes my discussion of the programs themselves, and I'll now get into the grant application process. And at the very beginning of this application discussion, I do want to highlight there are minimum requirements that projects must meet to qualify for consideration for DBW grants. These minimum qualifications are published on our website in the same document as our application scoring rubric. And if you have trouble locating that document, please let me know and I'll be happy to make sure you get a copy. A few of the more commonly asked about topics are shown here on the slide. I'll also most likely discuss these topics with you when you first contact me, call me to talk about your project ideas. I'll briefly highlight the examples listed here on the slide. First, a minimum qualification. There must be some public health and safety benefit for a project to be considered for funding. So for example, a project that only has recreational benefits or only environmental benefits will not be eligible for funding under either of our programs. Benefits to the public must be the lone reason DBW is being approached for funding. It's permissible for privately owned property to incidentally benefit from these projects, but that benefit must truly be incidental rather than directly intended. Now, the application must discuss alternatives to the project that the applicant has considered, and I'll discuss that topic in more detail later. And the last item on this slide, DBW requires applicants to estimate 20-year benefits to the public and 20-year costs that will result from the project. I get a lot of questions about this, and I'll talk about this in more detail later as well. So I've divided this segment of the webinar into two main sections. One focusing on questions calling for more of a narrative or free-form response, and another where more numeric information needs to be entered into an Excel spreadsheet. The topics listed in the next few slides are the narrative topics where I tend to get the most questions from year to year, is why I'm highlighting them today. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to the two separate applications for these programs as one application, just to avoid confusion and excessive wordiness. DBW's grant application is basically designed to collect all the typical data that would go into a standard pre-project feasibility report for really any agency, including your own. In addition, we also request information about the applicant's previous experiences with DBW, previous experience with the project site, and some other administration. But the core of it's the information you normally see in feasibility. DBW's primary goal in our application process is to collect a standardized set of information that we can use to assess how well different projects align with DBW statutory mandates. As you can imagine, we receive proposals for widely varying types of coastal solutions every year under both programs, and a degree of data standardization for our analysis and comparison is necessary. So now we'll get into some individual application items. And early on in the application, we ask for a high-level description on the expected overall scope of the project from beginning to end. And even if every detail of the solution to be constructed isn't known yet, even if different alternatives are still being considered, like if you're early in feasibility, the applicant should still have a clear idea, or at least a reasonably clear idea of what they expect the project to actually accomplish in the end, and an estimated timeline for getting there. I'll note here that DBW strongly prefers to only fund one phase of a project at a time. So for example, if you're seeking funding for design and construction at the same time, you'll find that DBW may ask questions about the reliability of your construction cost estimates, since if you haven't done a design yet, your cost estimate is probably still pretty preliminary. As I'll discuss more later, our experience is that applicants tend to significantly underestimate costs of construction early in a project's development. DBW also asks about whether agencies are aware of opposition to the proposed project. Often, as with many public works projects, there can be opposition when altering the coastline is suggested, whether that's opposition from local residents or environmental agencies, other groups, other stakeholders. The universally beloved coastal project is certainly possible, but it's rarer than one might think. So if an applicant claims they're unaware of any opposition, that's fantastic, but we still may follow up with questions about that. And even objections the applicant considers minor should still be reported to us here. DBW asks for information about ownership and control of the project area, and this is important to us for a couple of main reasons. First and foremost, we need to make sure the applicant has authority to construct a solution where they intend to do so. And secondly, we need to make sure the applicant has the authority to make long-term commitments to maintain the project area after construction is completed. If the grantee intends to transfer the property after the project is finished, the grantee's maintenance activities may not continue, which could end up reducing or even eliminating the public benefits of the public investment in the project. The next item, item 19, is specific to the interest state parks may have in any portion of the property to be protected. DBW needs to verify the extent to which state parks property may be impacted by the project. As you might know, state parks controls a lot of California's coastal property and has its own policies regarding maintaining its property and allowing natural processes to continue without interference. There are also special financial rules that apply to projects intended to protect state parks property. A project that will solely benefit a state park or a state beach won't actually be eligible for funding through our programs, since there's a different funding process set up for projects like those. However, if a state park or a state beach will only indirectly benefit from or be indirectly impacted by a local project, we may still be able to consider funding that local project. If an operating agreement between state parks and an applicant is in place at a proposed project site, that agreement may have a maintenance requirement built into it already, and DBW's grant programs might not be able to pay for maintenance of property that's the contractual responsibility of a local operator. Also, beach sand placement may or may not fit the definition of a maintenance activity depending on the situation. Item 29 of the application asks about how the project is expected to address sea level rise. State policy requires state agencies like DBW to incorporate climate change and sea level rise considerations into our investment decisions. And sea level rise is a problem that will become more and more impactful statewide over a long time period, so it requires long-term solutions and foresight. I'm often asked what long-term means to DBW in terms of sea level rise, like what's the long term? As a rule of thumb, 50 years is a reasonable long-term horizon for DBW's purposes, and some planning guidance has forecasts that look farther out, and the appropriate planning horizon may be different for different sites. So I can give you a rule of thumb, but different places might have different requirements. For your information, recent sources of state level advice for sea level rise planning include 2018 guidance from the Ocean Protection Council and California Coastal Commission guidance that was most recently updated in 2018 as well. Both of these policy documents are available online, and I'll be happy to help you find them if you'd like. Item 34 asks for an estimated project schedule. The grant application doesn't require you to submit your schedule in any particular format, so long as it's informative. Estimated months and years, the key project milestones will be reached are the important information here. The DBW asks for the project schedule for several reasons. First, we want to make sure the grant request is coming to us at an appropriate time. DBW funding isn't available until about 18 months after the application deadline at the earliest, so agencies that need funding sooner may need to look for alternative funding sources. Second, we have to make sure the grant-funded portion of the project can be completed within the period of time at which state funding would be authorized for use if your application is successful. And that time limit is currently up to 4 years after the first date funding is authorized through the state budget. So for example, a 6-year study or a construction project that won't be finished until 2029 wouldn't be eligible for funding in our 2022-2023 budget, since completion would be too far out to fit within that 4-year window. A third thing that we look for here, the schedule has to generally be logical and credible. For example, a schedule that suggests construction will occur promptly after a feasibility study ends will raise questions about the project's engineering, environmental, and permitting processes. Item 38 requires applicants to identify the alternatives to the project they have considered and why the proposed solution has been selected. And in the past, some applicants have either skipped this item entirely or have summarily dismissed all alternatives besides the preferred approach with no or with minimal explanation. And we get it, DBW understands by the time an applicant is committed to pursuing a specific erosion solution, your agency is invested in that approach and might not want to revisit the merits of other options you've already considered and discarded. However, for DBW's purposes, we need to verify that meaningful consideration of alternatives took place. There are certainly areas of the coastline where maintaining the no project condition or pursuing managed retreat really is infeasible and impractical. We get that. But if that's the case, tell us why instead of assuming that it's obvious. What's obvious to you might not be so obvious to us. And so now I'm going to move past the narrative and talk about the more numbers-focused piece of the application, the Excel workbook. DBW has developed this workbook in an effort to collect similar quantitative information from agencies that are proposing very different projects. The format of the spreadsheet also clarifies DBW's expectations about which forms of estimated data we need to obtain during the application process, respecting project benefits and project costs. And on the next few slides, I'll speak briefly to what we're looking for on each tab of that workbook. Application item 35 requires applicants to report and to quantify the benefits they expect the public to realize from the project. And of course, DBW understands some benefits resulting from coastal protection projects are difficult to quantify. A dollar value for many types of benefits can only be roughly estimated and imperfectly estimated, and that's fine, that's okay. What we need to see is where your agency thinks the value of the public investment in the project will come from. And costs are very measurable, public dollars are measurable and limited. So your perspective on the corresponding value of benefits the project would create is really important, even if some benefits seem intangible. And the dollar value of future costs avoided is one important type of benefit that these projects can provide. In fact, very often costs avoided represent the project's primary benefit, and in all cases, they should not be overlooked. Examples of costs avoided can include avoiding infrastructure repair costs or avoiding environmental remediation, or even avoiding costs associated with life safety incidents like rescues, and so on. Our experience is that once planners start looking at benefits with the cost avoided approach in mind, this whole exercise becomes easier and less daunting than it seemed at the beginning. And of course, I'm available to answer your questions on this subject as you complete your application. So having said all that, I'll briefly walk through each column here to quickly discuss the kinds of information DBW is looking for. In the first column, we ask the applicant to briefly identify the benefit to be obtained. And since these benefits were also discussed earlier in the application, a lengthy descriptive narrative in this column on the spreadsheet is not necessary. In the second column, we ask you to estimate an annual value for each benefit. And again, that's an estimate to the best of your ability, knowing full well sometimes you have to ballpark these. The third column seeks the number of years after construction during which that benefit is expected to be provided. And this ties to the concept of annual value of benefits from the previous column. So looking at the example row shown on the slide, if an imaginary near-shore sheriff substation is expected to sustain major flood damage once during a 10-year period before it's replaced, at a one-time uninsured imaginary public cost of $100,000, the average replacement cost avoided per year, 10 years, $10,000. And if you're wondering whether benefits and costs should be discounted for inflation or if depreciation should be factored in, the answer is almost always no. It's not necessary for DBW's analysis. We factor short-term cost escalation and inflation into our short-term cost estimates ourselves. But other than that, we don't make time-based adjustments to either the benefit side or the cost side of this analysis. So the time factor is basically even out. Also, on this benefits subject, please do not include incidental benefits or direct benefits to private property owners in this list of public benefits. DBW is not an insurer of private property, and we will not consider private benefits in our benefit cost calculations. All the benefits in that calculation have to be public. Also keep in mind this question asks for the expected benefits of the project for up to 20 years. So please think beyond the short term and be sure to include longer term benefits, particularly those costs avoided. Application item 36 requires the applicant to report expected project costs. There are two separate areas of the Excel workbook for costs, one for more current immediate costs and another for related costs farther out down the road. I will talk about the more immediate costs first. As I mentioned earlier, one frequent challenge in coastal projects is some planners' inclination to underestimate how much it'll eventually cost to construct and then maintain a project. And we really ask that applicants be realistic here in estimating the likely cost of their projects and to really take the time to make sure that they've assessed how expensive it'll be beyond the short term to manage their shoreline issues, including potential replacement of, say, a restored beach. The cost sheet here may be a little bit more intuitive to fill out than the benefit sheet was. Columns going from left to right call for the applicant to identify a cost category, a cost activity, whatever unit of measure is appropriate for that item, lump sum, cubic yard, what have you. Number of units of that item that will be paid for, and the current price per unit of that item. Unquantifiable costs aren't expected or anticipated here, but if your project expects to incur any costs like that, please notify me. I'll work through those on a case-by-case basis. And item 36 also requires applicants to report expected future project costs. Now we know if you're asking for funding the feasibility phase of a multi-phase beach restoration project, or if you're seeking funding for feasibility phase work on a seawall where different sizes and locations of seawalls are being considered, you might not even have an engineering cost estimate yet. And you might still be sorting through different potential solutions, alternatives, and their expected costs. And, even at the start of design, you'll probably still be working off of an engineer's preliminary cost estimate, which is subject to considerable change as design unfolds, and that impacts your future costs down the line too. Now, having said and acknowledged all that, DBW's expectation and our experience is that agencies do tend to have at least a rough idea of the scale of future public investment that will be required in conjunction with the currently proposed project. We've provided some examples of future activities in the spreadsheet listed 1 through 6 here, and those might or might not apply to your specific projects, but they might. So hopefully it's helpful guidance. We ask simply that you make your best effort here to report reasonably foreseeable future costs. Turning from costs to funding sources the applicant expects to use to cover those costs. State funding for these programs, DBW, is limited, so part of our goal when funding projects is to maximize the value of state investments by partnering on projects and stretching our own dollars. Other state agencies like the State Coastal Conservancy, the Ocean Protection Council periodically advertise grant opportunities for coastal projects. So, we encourage you to keep your eye out for opportunities through those agencies. And there's also a relatively new web resource called the California Grants Portal at grants.ca.gov. The state rolled out around mid-2020. I encourage you to consult this site to look for coastal grant opportunities, and for that matter, other types of grant opportunities that may benefit your agency in numerous ways beyond your coastal endeavors. Federal cost sharing can enable state funds to be used especially efficiently. So if federal funding is an option for your project, if your federal involvement would fit well with your strategy for this project, then we encourage you to pursue that federal funding option. DBW understands local agencies may often have few sources of revenue to turn to for coastal projects, few internal sources of revenue. Some locations have implemented transient occupancy taxes or real estate transfer taxes, parking fees, and other assorted revenue producing programs for the specific purpose of coastal protection. We do understand, we know that these approaches aren't feasible for every local coastal agency, but through these approaches I've listed or through other creative solutions, DBW does appreciate opportunities to partner with agencies that can help keep the state's cost contributions relatively low. And for beach restoration projects where multiple rounds of nourishment over time will be necessary, sometimes, going back to the topic I've already discussed, there's a tendency for project planners to figure out how to pay for the first phase of the project without considering how future phases will be funded, what the costs are going to be down the road. If the applicant's hope is for DBW to fund both the current and the future phases of a beach restoration project, such as with the 50-year Army Corps project, that's fine, we do that. But this intention should be communicated to DBW as part of the application process. Keep in mind that a current state legislature, the one making the current state budget, can't make financial or budget commitments on behalf of future state legislators. So now we're at item 37 on the application, the benefit cost ratio. This ratio will auto-populate in the Excel workbook based on your responses to items 35 and 36. DBW's purpose for computing a benefit cost ratio is to verify that public benefits of the project will exceed public costs. That's really it. It's really that simple. We realize it may seem like a good idea to present an idealized benefit cost ratio, but idealized benefit estimates, idealized cost estimates. So the ratio looks really high and really impressive. However, there aren't any bonus points in our scoring system and our ranking system for a high ratio here. DBW is simply trying to make sure the project's public benefits will amount to more than its public costs, and we rely on applicants to provide a credible analysis to get us there. So turning back to matching funds. For both programs, state law and DBW policy require matching funds and/or pre-approved in-kind services from grantees. DBW must approve the grantee's match plan in advance, and the grantee must provide documentation during the project, during the performance period, verifying that it's providing its match as promised. The match requirement cannot be waived. So for the Shoreline Erosion Control Program, I'm going to walk through both programs briefly, what the match requirement entails. Shoreline Erosion Control, a state can contribute a maximum of half of the non-federal cost share. So the slide shows two example scenarios for a hypothetical $1 million project. In the first scenario, where a federal cost contribution brings the remaining cost down to $400,000, DBW can fund half of that $400,000 or $200,000. So that leaves $200,000 to come from other sources. In the second scenario shown here, which does not have a federal contribution, the cost to both the local agency and to DBW would be higher. DBW's maximum grant would be $500,000, and the grantee would have to provide at least $500,000 in match. One more thing to note here is the timing on when match can be provided. It has to be provided during the grant performance period itself. In-kind services or local investments the grantee provides before or after the grant period cannot be counted towards match, even if those amounts are substantial and if they're really, really closely tied to the project that's being applied for. Still, we can't count it unless it actually happens during the performance period. So the same general rules apply on match for the Public Beach Restoration Program, except the possible percentage split of costs is different. DBW can fund up to 85% of the non-federal project costs in most cases, instead of 50%, and 85% of total costs if there's no federal cost sharing. The examples here are the same as those shown on the prior slide, but the potential grant contribution amounts reflect the higher proportional amounts DBW can fund under this program. So in the first example, the potential DBW grant increases from $200,000 from the Shoreline Erosion Control Program The $340,000 here, with everything else being equal, the $1 million total cost and the 60% federal contribution. Second example, you see that the DBW contribution also increases. It was $500,000 under this program. It can be $850,000. But remember, there is a very narrow category of projects that DBW can fund under this program, specifically the engineered placement of sand on the beach or in the near shore environment, and projects that are directly tied to that function. So that's it for the individual application items covered in the webinar, and I will shift gears now and discuss some administrative aspects of the application process. To begin with, this year for the first time, DBW is requiring all applicants to apply for these grants through an online process. DBW is no longer accepting hard copy applications for these programs. DBW's online grant application, also known as OLGA, allows applicants to submit all the required application materials through an online portal. It works much like filling out a form and uploading attachments like you've probably done before for online surveys or job applications or what have you. A little while back, DBW taped a separate webinar specific to the OLGA system, basically a tutorial, and there's a link on the screen if you'd like to check that out. That's the YouTube link, which I'll be happy to send you upon request after the webinar. The OLGA tutorial is not specific to the coastal program grant applications, but it will still help you register for the OLGA site and help you get used to its navigation. So let me know if you have any difficulties accessing the OLGA site. I know there were some issues with it last year, but those have been rectified this year. It's working a lot more smoothly now. I'll only briefly touch on the scoring and ranking criteria during this presentation. Those criteria are based on priorities established in state law and state policy, just like all the questions in the grant application itself. The application is designed so there's more than one place you can describe how a project will protect public health and safety, how a project will address sea level rise, and so on for several main points of emphasis in our criteria. The application is not designed so you simply get 10 points for one question, 25 points for another question, and so on. And we designed it that way on purpose, intentionally, because we want applicants to tell us a complete story of their projects without being entirely focused only on the scoring rubric. Looking at key application cycle dates, applications are typically due between mid-December and early February each year. For funding to be available about 18 months after the application deadline. So for example, we're recording this in early 2021, and the application deadline is February 1st, 2021 for funding that will be available at the start of fiscal year 2022-2023, and that's mid-2022 around July. Please check the website each year for these deadlines since they are subject to change from year to year. DBW requires all applicants to submit an approved resolution that confirms the applicant's governing body, like its city council or board of supervisors, is aware of the application and approves of it being submitted. We realize the resolution often has to trail the application for logistical reasons, and that's fine, but do not forget or neglect this requirement since it is mandatory. Deadline for DBW to receive the fully executed resolution is on the application webpage, usually a couple of months after the application deadline. And we won't extend this grace period for individual applicants since we do have a limited amount of time internally to conduct our own process. Within 2 to 3 months after applications are received, DBW staff will visit proposed project sites that we aren't already familiar with to validate information in applications and to fill in any gaps in our understanding that might result from our initial read of the application. We prefer to have applicant agency present at these site visits, and we'll try to work with your office to find a mutually agreeable day and time for them. Now, after you apply, DBW will contact you to verify your application is complete. And in addition, as I just mentioned, we'll most likely come out to visit the proposed project site unless we're already familiar with it. And we may ask additional questions after our site visit. Once DBW staff completes our initial application review, we turn the applications over to a separate team at state parks to score the application based on the criteria posted on our website. So in other words, the DBW staffers who come out and visit the site, including myself, will not actually be the same ones who score your application, although the scorers will receive information from our site visits before they begin their scoring process. Once scoring is complete, DBW will submit information about these programs' applications for consideration in the state's annual confidential budget process. This process is external from DBW. It involves the governor's office, the legislature, and various other state agencies. So from about May until early January, which is when the governor's initial proposed budget is released, it's unlikely you'll hear anything from DBW about your application unless someone involved in the budget process comes to us and asks DBW for additional information about your project. Unless that happens, DBW staff doesn't know the status of your individual application vis-a-vis that process. So you're welcome to call me and ask, but I'm not going to have information for you, unfortunately. So I will now turn from the application process to what you would have to look forward to in the future as a successful applicant managing a DBW grant. So once a project is authorized to receive a grant in the state budget, a few more things need to happen before grant funds officially become available. Agencies must not start incurring grant-funded expenses before their grant agreement with DBW is fully executed. After budget authorization for a grant is confirmed, DBW will prepare a grant agreement, and this agreement will contain a scope of work, identifying exactly what DBW will fund, and I'll talk more about that scope of work in just a moment. DBW grant funds are provided on a reimbursement basis, and this involves the grantee submitting a formal letter to DBW during the performance period, asking for a specific amount of reimbursement. These letters must be accompanied by documents supporting the request, which are typically contractor invoices and proof of payment of those invoices by the grantee. And we also, in conjunction with these reimbursement requests, need to receive documentation of match contributions as the grantee makes them. DBW will periodically verify project progress is being made. Sometimes mid-project activities will require DBW's approval. For example, during preparation of designs, during the engineering phase, DBW's engineers will typically need to periodically review draft designs, typically at completion intervals of 30%, 60%, 90%, and 100. And we do this to ensure timely, appropriate progress is being made, and permitting information is being incorporated timely as well. At the end of a project, both the grantee and DBW must accept the project for it to be considered complete. And for construction projects, DBW will come out to visit the project site to verify completion before providing final reimbursements. For other types of projects like feasibility and design, we'll receive deliverables, the final study document, the final designs, whatever deliverables we've agreed to as part of the scope of work. And finally, for most projects, DBW will retain 10% of reimbursable expenses from grant funds during the course of the project. This retention will eventually be released when the project is accepted as complete at the end by both the grantee and by DBW. And one more discussion point for grant management before I switch to your questions. This looks at how the scope of work is managed before and after and during, not after, before and during the grant project. As you know, grant money typically comes with restrictions on allowable expenses, and funding from DBW's programs is no exception. The scope of work defines how our grant funds will be used. The scope of work will identify the tasks to be completed, their respective budgets, and the anticipated schedule for completing each main task. Note that the project budget should usually include allowances for time-based cost escalation and a contingency where warranted. It's usually warranted. DBW must pre-approve all subcontracts that will be funded using the grant. We won't involve ourselves in your local bidding process, but we must review subcontracts before they're executed to make sure they comply with basic state requirements, like forbidding legally sanctioned forms of hiring discrimination. Since DBW grant funds are state funds, they must be spent in accordance with state requirements. Change orders during the project can be accepted and allowable, but they must be approved in writing by DBW unless they're below a dollar threshold as specified in the grant agreement. And note that even if change orders are justified, the overall DBW grant amount cannot be increased or augmented without going through the state budget process all over again, so cost control is always critical. If overruns for individual budget lines come up during the project, DBW will require the grantee to demonstrate how those overages will be covered. Projects must remain fully funded at all times for DBW to be able to continue participating as a grantor. So that concludes the substantial part of my presentation. I'm going to switch out of screen sharing mode and look for questions in just a moment. Before I do, I did want to say thank you for being here, for listening to my presentation, for your interest in our grant programs. And after this webinar is over, I do really hope that you'll reach out to me with any feedback, anything positive or negative about this presentation that you I suggest I repeat or do differently in the future. We plan on doing these webinars again in the future, and we want them to get better and better. We want them to be useful for you. I want to be here as a good resource for you. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to switch out now and look for questions. Okay, right now I'm only seeing one question, and it's about for project benefits on the Excel spreadsheet. If our project involves protection of several public utility lines, do we need to separate out benefits of avoided damage costs by each public utility, or can we group together as one line item? I think it's completely fair in that case to simply group those as one benefit. And if we have questions about it, then we'll certainly ask you. I think it would be beneficial to us to have a full scope of what the utility lines are, like who the utility providers are, a list of those, but you wouldn't need to break those out utility by utility. We'll ask for that information if we need it. So thank you for that question. And I'm not seeing any others at the moment. So what I think I'll do is I will wait another second here, but otherwise I'll give you all, one more question. Can grant funds substantially benefit state parks? Substantially benefits an interesting term. Really at the core, what we're trying to avoid is a project that's specifically designed to benefit the state park itself. There are numerous places along the coastline where it's unavoidable that a project is going to benefit a state park, particularly a beach restoration project that's a little bit north of a state park. You place the sand just north, the littoral cell drift, that sand's going to wind up being on the state beach nearby. And we wouldn't disqualify a project just for that. Now, if you're looking at placing the sand directly on the state beach itself, that's where we would have an issue. If you have a sand placement that's unavoidably, partially on the state beach and partially not, chances are we're going to be okay. It's going to be case by case, and we can be happy to talk through that. But the real intent is to avoid being in a scenario where we're funding something through state funds for a state beach that needs to be funded through a different methodology. So I hope that's helpful and clear enough. Okay, if a local agency receives partial state funding, can they still be used to fund over the 50%? I assume that's referring to the Shoreline Erosion Control Program and the 50% limit. And the way the statute's written is that half of the funding for a project can come from state funds, half of it has to come from some other source. So if DBW funds 50% of a project, what can't happen is that we have a second state agency that comes in and funds another 10%, 20%, what have you, because then we're over that 50% that the state can fund. So the total state funding DBW plus other agencies would be 50%. If that didn't answer your question, let me know. Okay, and if there are no other questions right now, then I'm happy to give you all the gift of time. Enjoy the remainder of your day, and I'm being asked if I see a question about ranking methodology, and I actually don't see that question. Oh, I'm sorry. There it is. Where can we find the application ranking methodology? Thanks for the heads up. The application ranking methodology is posted on our website, and I'll be happy to email that to you as well. So if you have any difficulty finding it, please let me know, and I'll be happy to help. Question, I'm sorry if I missed it, but will this recording be posted or emailed out? The recording will be posted in the next few days, assuming everything's working correctly. And when it's available, I will be more than happy to send out an email letting you know that it's available. If benefits involve avoiding damage from a major coastal storm anticipated to increase with SLR but may not occur annually, how do we calculate the length, timing, and lifespan of that benefit? Is that still considered an annual benefit? Great question. The answer is that we know this is difficult. It's just the kind of thing that you have to annualize and estimate over time. So looking at a situation where you might have an incident every 5 years, just kind of reverse engineer the math. So it's estimated for what would be the annual long-term cost or annual long-term benefit. So I'm not seeing any other questions right now. I'm double checking my chat box to make sure I didn't miss any. If I did, I truly apologize. And please drop me a note if you have anything that I haven't addressed that you think of now or later. Really appreciate all of your time. Thanks so much for being part of this. Enjoy your day, and I will be at your disposal if you have any questions. Thanks so much.